Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Ethan always thought he knew Claudia better than anyone else on earth. 12 years of marriage built an intimacy that went beyond words, a silent understanding he believed was unshakable. He took pride in it, in the way they could finish each other's sentences, share inside jokes no one else got, and spend hours debating the books she read and the engineering projects he worked on. At 42, Ethan had a solid career as a civil engineer specializing in bridges, employed by one of Portland, Oregon's most respected construction firms. Claudia, 3 years younger, taught English literature at a suburban high school, known for her engaging classes and her ability to make bored teenagers fall in love with Shakespeare and Fitzgerald. They didn't have kids, a mutual decision made years ago, preferring to invest in travel, cultural experiences, and a life together free from the responsibilities of parenthood. It never felt like a problem. In fact, they always felt they had the freedom to be themselves, to explore the world together without strings. Their friendship with Greg and Natalie began naturally, almost inevitably. The four met 4 years ago at a monthly wine club held at a boutique winery in downtown Portland. Greg, a 44-year-old successful businessman who ran a small chain of artisanal coffee shops around the city, had a relaxed sophistication that Ethan admired. Natalie, his 37-year-old wife, was a professional photographer specializing in artistic portraits and urban landscapes, with a portfolio that had already been displayed in local galleries. From their first meeting, all four clicked. Conversations flowed easily, covering art, politics, philosophy, indie films, and of course, wine. They started meeting outside the club, dinner at charming restaurants, board game nights at Greg and Natalie's place, afternoon tastings at wineries in the Willamette Valley. Ethan liked how Greg challenged his views on architecture and urban design, and Claudia was captivated by Natalie's stories of her photographic travels through Central America and Asia. It seemed like a perfect friendship, balanced, enriching. When Greg proposed the trip to the Oregon coast, Ethan accepted without hesitation. For days visiting award-winning wineries, staying at a seaside boutique resort, with time to relax and reconnect away from work pressures. Claudia was thrilled, saying she desperately needed a break from the endless stacks of papers to grade and the drama of high school students. Ethan also felt the weight of tight deadlines, endless client meetings, and construction inspections that ate up his weeks. The idea of 4 days with no obligations, just good food, great wine, and the company of close friends, seemed exactly what they both needed. The trip began on a clear Friday morning, with all four leaving Portland for the coast in 2 separate but matching SUVs, agreeing to meet at strategic stops along the way. Their first stop was a family-owned winery known for its exceptional Pinot Noirs. They walked through the vineyards, learning about cultivation, then did a guided tasting in the barrel room. Ethan watched Claudia laughing with Natalie as they took selfies among the vines, her hair glowing in the autumn sun. She looked so happy, so free. He felt a wave of gratitude for having her by his side. The resort where they stayed was even better than the photos on the website promised. Perched on a cliff with a panoramic view of the Pacific Ocean, the place blended understated luxury with rustic charm, featuring individual bungalows scattered across carefully landscaped gardens. Ethan and Claudia's room had a fireplace, a hot tub facing the sea, and a private balcony where they could listen to the waves crashing against the rocks below. They spent the afternoon exploring the property, walking the empty beach, collecting seashells, and talking about future plans. Claudia mentioned she'd been thinking about writing a book, maybe a novel based on her experiences as a teacher. Ethan encouraged her, saying she had more than enough talent for it. Everything felt perfect. The first 2 days followed this idyllic rhythm. They visited more wineries, dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, watched the sunset from the resort's balcony with wine glasses in hand. Greg was a generous host, insisting on paying for most meals and sharing expensive bottles from his personal collection. Natalie documented everything with her professional camera, capturing spontaneous moments she said would make an incredible memory album. Ethan felt grateful for the friendship, for the quality of those days. Claudia also seemed to be enjoying herself, actively joining conversations, debating politics and culture with Greg, and exchanging book recommendations with Natalie. But it was on the third night that everything changed. After a particularly long dinner at a sophisticated French restaurant, where they consumed 2 bottles of Bordeaux and 1 of champagne, the 4 returned to the resort around 11 at night. Greg suggested continuing the conversation in his suite, which was larger and had a spacious balcony with a view of the moonlit ocean. Ethan agreed, still under the pleasant effects of the wine, feeling relaxed and content. Claudia grabbed a bottle of port they'd bought earlier and brought it along. Greg and Natalie's suite was truly impressive, with a spacious living area tastefully decorated, a gas fireplace lit, and glass doors opening onto the balcony. They settled into comfortable sofas, the conversation flowing as naturally as always. Natalie poured the port into small crystal glasses, and the talk started light, revisiting the best moments of the trip. But slowly, the tone shifted. Greg began talking about how modern life imposes so many artificial restrictions on people, how we're conditioned from childhood to follow social scripts that don't always make sense for who we truly are. Natalie agreed, saying she and Greg had a relationship she described as unconventional, built on open communication and a rejection of oppressive norms. Ethan listened with interest, but still distantly, like someone enjoying an abstract philosophical discussion. Then Natalie said, with a smile that mixed challenge and camaraderie, that she and Greg had explored opening their relationship on a few occasions. Not often, she clarified, but when opportunities arose with people they trusted. Greg added that it had actually strengthened their marriage, because it eliminated the hypocrisy and resentment that come with repressed desires. Ethan frowned, but still didn't see where this was going. He looked at Claudia, expecting her to share his surprise, but she seemed fascinated by the conversation, leaning forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. That's when Claudia said something that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. She commented, with a casualness that unsettled him, that she'd always found the idea of couples who could separate sex from love fascinating, and that, deep down, emotional loyalty was what truly mattered, not physical exclusivity. Ethan stared at her, trying to figure out if she was just being intellectually provocative or if there was something deeper behind those words. Before he could process it, Natalie made the suggestion that would shatter the trip: what if we tried it tonight? Swap partners. No drama, no jealousy. Just 4 adults exploring a fantasy consensually. The silence that followed felt eternal. Ethan felt as if the floor had vanished beneath his feet. He looked at Claudia, hoping she'd laugh, say it was absurd, but she didn't do either. Instead, she bit her lower lip, a gesture he knew well and recognized as a sign she was seriously considering it. Ethan felt a wave of nausea. Greg and Natalie watched, waiting for a reaction. Greg's expression was calm, expectant. Natalie smiled encouragingly, as if suggesting they try a new restaurant. Ethan forced himself to speak, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Are you serious, Claudia?" She looked at him, and for a moment he saw hesitation in her eyes, but then she answered, choosing each word carefully, as if presenting an academic argument. "I don't see a problem with exploring, as long as everyone's comfortable. The body is just a physical experience, Ethan. The love we have is much bigger than one night." Greg nodded, saying jealousy is a primitive emotion evolved people learn to overcome. Natalie added it would be an opportunity for personal growth, expanding the limits of what they thought possible in a relationship. Ethan felt anger begin to boil inside him, but he tried to keep it under control. He looked around the room, at the 3 people who, just minutes before, he'd considered close, and realized he was being manipulated. The trip, the intimate conversations of the past few days, the philosophy about freedom and oppressive norms, it had all been preparation for this moment. They'd planned this. Claudia, his wife, the woman he loved and trusted above all else, was suggesting he hand her over to another man as if it were an emotionless transaction. And worse, she did it with the same cold, articulate logic she used to teach Hamlet to teenagers. He stood up, feeling his temples throb. Grabbing his coat was automatic, something to do with his trembling hands. When he spoke, his voice was firm, but beneath it lay a tremor of barely contained emotion. "You can do whatever you want. I'm not part of this." Claudia immediately tried to argue, standing up and walking toward him. She said he was being narrow-minded, conservative, that he was missing a chance to grow as a person and strengthen their relationship through trust. Ethan stopped at the door and turned to face her. What he saw on her face, a mix of frustration and disappointment, like he'd failed some test, was what finally broke something inside him. "I don't need to grow up sleeping with my friend's wife, Claudia," he said, each word deliberate and cutting. "And if you do, then we don't share the same values. I thought we did. But I was wrong." He walked out of the suite, ignoring Claudia's pleas for him to come back, to talk. Greg tried to say something about him overreacting, but Ethan didn't look back. He hurried along the resort's lit paths to his own bungalow, grabbed his car keys and suitcase, and 15 minutes later, he was on the road back to Portland, alone, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The 3-hour drive was silent torture. Ethan mentally replayed every conversation from the past few weeks, searching for signs he should have noticed. Now they jumped out at him with painful clarity. Claudia had always been fascinated by literature exploring non-traditional relationships. She loved Lady Chatterley's Lover, passionately defended Lolita as a masterpiece despite its controversial content, and had recently read The Ethical Slut, commenting on how liberating it was. He'd assumed those were just academic interests, the curious mind of a literature teacher exploring complex themes. But they weren't. They were desires, fantasies she'd been nurturing, and finally found an opportunity to express. Ethan got home around 3 in the morning, physically and emotionally drained. He went straight to the guest room, unable to even look at the bed he'd shared with Claudia. He couldn't sleep. Lying in the dark, listening to the silence of the house, he felt betrayed in a way that went beyond the physical proposal. It was Claudia's philosophical coldness that hurt most, the way she rationalized the disrespect, turning a potential betrayal into an intellectual exercise in personal growth. Claudia came home the next day around noon, brought back by Greg and Natalie. Ethan heard the car pull into the garage but didn't leave his office, where he was pretending to work on projects. She entered alone, her steps hesitant. When she appeared in the office doorway, her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She started talking quickly, saying it had just been a suggestion, that she never expected him to react so strongly, that she didn't mean to hurt him, that she'd been influenced by wine and Natalie's ideas. Ethan let her talk, watching her with an emotional distance he didn't even recognize. When she finished, he simply said, "The suggestion itself was the betrayal, Claudia. You thinking it would be acceptable to ask me this, that I'd agree to watch you with another man, shows you don't know me. Or worse, you don't care how I feel." She tried to protest, but he raised his hand, asking for silence. "I've scheduled a consultation with a divorce lawyer for Monday. You can stay in the house until we sort out the details, but I'll be in the guest room. I don't want to talk about this anymore." Claudia began crying, saying she loved him, that it had been a terrible mistake, that she'd never do it again. But Ethan held firm. For him, love without respect wasn't love. It was just emotional convenience. And he deserved more than that. The following days were a blur of tense conversations, heavy silences, and Claudia's tears. Ethan shut down emotionally, functioning on autopilot, going to work, coming home late, avoiding contact. Greg called a few times, but Ethan blocked the number. Natalie sent a long message explaining they never meant to cause problems, but Ethan deleted it without reading to the end. The divorce process was formally started 2 weeks later. With no children, the most complicated part was dividing assets. They owned the house, which Ethan had bought before marriage but had been renovated during their relationship with joint funds. They had shared investment accounts, 2 cars, and years of intertwined lives to untangle. Ethan's lawyer, a pragmatic 60-year-old named Arthur, advised him to seek an amicable settlement to avoid prolonging the suffering. Ethan agreed, not out of generosity, but exhaustion. He didn't want to drag this out for months. He wanted to turn the page as quickly as possible. Claudia initially resisted the divorce, asking for time to rebuild trust, but Ethan was firm. She finally accepted when she realized he wouldn't change his mind. They reached an agreement where Ethan kept the house, since he'd made the initial payment and had deeper emotional ties to the property. In exchange, he paid Claudia a financial settlement equal to half its current market value. She took her car, and they split the investment accounts evenly. It was clinical, cold, devoid of the emotion that should have accompanied the end of 12 years together. But it was the only way Ethan could handle it. The news of the divorce spread quickly among their mutual friends. Some sided with Claudia, saying Ethan had been too extreme, that couples go through crises and he should have given her a second chance. Others, especially Ethan's closer friends, understood when he briefly explained what had happened. He never gave specifics, just said there had been an irreparable breach of trust. Greg and Natalie tried to defend themselves on social media, posting about judgment and people stuck in outdated paradigms, but it only pushed them further away from the social circle they'd shared with Ethan and Claudia. Interestingly, a few months after Ethan's divorce, he heard through an acquaintance that Greg and Natalie were also facing serious problems. Apparently, Natalie discovered Greg had developed genuine feelings for Claudia that went beyond the consensual experience he'd championed. There had been messages exchanged between Greg and Claudia after the failed trip, messages Natalie found that revealed an emotional intimacy contradicting their entire philosophy of separating sex from love. Their marriage fell into crisis, and the last thing Ethan heard was that they were in couples therapy, trying to salvage what remained. He felt a bitter satisfaction at that, a confirmation that hypocrisy had been at the heart of the whole episode. Claudia tried to reconnect a few months later. She sent a series of long messages saying she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, that it hadn't been worth it, that she'd spent the past months in therapy trying to understand why she'd sabotaged their marriage. She said she'd grown, changed, now understood the value of what they'd had. Ethan read the messages but didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. What she'd done wasn't a momentary mistake, it was a revelation of who she truly was beneath the intellectual facade. And that person wasn't someone he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. Ethan slowly focused on rebuilding his life. He threw himself into work, taking on more challenging projects that required frequent travel to other cities. That helped fill the void, avoiding lonely nights in the house he'd once shared with Claudia. He started going to the gym regularly, not to meet anyone, but to channel his anger and sadness into something productive. He lost weight, gained muscle, felt physically better than he had in years. It was at a civil engineering conference in San Francisco, about 8 months after the divorce, that Ethan met Rachel. She was an architect specializing in sustainable design, presenting an innovative bridge project that integrated solar panels into the structure. They sat together at the conference lunch and started talking. The connection was immediate, but different from what he'd had with Claudia. Rachel was direct, honest in a disarmingly simple way. When he mentioned he was divorced, she simply nodded and said she was too, that she understood how hard it was to start over. They exchanged numbers and kept talking after the conference. His relationship with Rachel grew slowly, organically, without pressure. They saw each other when they could, she lived in San Francisco, he in Portland, but talked every day. She had clear values about commitment and loyalty, shaped by her own difficult divorce. Ethan appreciated her clarity, the absence of mental games or complicated philosophies about relationships. It was simple, they liked each other, respected each other, and wanted to see where it might lead. It took over a year for Ethan to finally feel ready to commit again. Rachel was patient, never pressuring, understanding he carried scars. When he finally asked her to move to Portland, she accepted. They rented a new house together, deciding not to bring the weight of the past into their new relationship. It was a fresh start, a blank page where they could write a different story. Ethan never saw Claudia in person after the divorce was finalized. He heard, through the same acquaintance who told him about Greg and Natalie, that she'd left the school where she taught and moved to Seattle, trying to start over far from Portland's memories. He sincerely hoped she found the peace she was searching for, but he knew it wouldn't be with him. Some doors, once closed, shouldn't be reopened. Some betrayals, even if never physically consummated, destroy trust in an irreparable way. Over time, Ethan learned to look back without the sharp pain he'd felt in the first months. The experience taught him valuable lessons about himself, about what he was willing to tolerate and what was non-negotiable. He learned that loyalty and respect aren't oppressive social constructs, as Claudia and her friends claimed, but the very pillars on which genuine relationships are built. Without them, everything else is just theater, a hollow performance of intimacy with no real foundation. He also learned to trust again, slowly, with Rachel. She never gave him reason to doubt, never spoke about opening the relationship or overcoming primitive jealousy. She was simply present, consistent, honest. And that was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything Ethan had always wanted but hadn't fully appreciated until he lost it. Sometimes, on quiet nights when Rachel was asleep and he lay awake staring at the ceiling, Ethan thought about the trip to the Oregon coast. He wondered if things could have been different if he'd noticed the signs sooner, if he'd paid closer attention to the subtle changes in Claudia. But then he remembered something his lawyer Arthur had told him during the divorce proceedings: don't blame yourself for not seeing what someone was deliberately hiding. Claudia hadn't revealed her true desires until she felt she had a safe opportunity, until she was surrounded by allies who would validate her choices. There was nothing Ethan could have done to prevent it. What he could control was how he responded, and in that, he had no regrets. He held on to his dignity, his values, his sense of what marriage should be. He didn't accept excuses, didn't let himself be manipulated by hollow philosophical arguments, and didn't let guilt make him question his own judgment. He simply walked away, processed the pain, and moved on. And in that, he found his own kind of victory. Life went on, as it always does. Ethan thrived in his career, designing increasingly ambitious and complex bridges. He built a new life with Rachel, stronger and more honest than the one he'd had with Claudia. And though the scars never fully disappeared, they became part of his story, permanent reminders that he survived, learned, and emerged stronger on the other side. Some lessons are learned the hardest way, but they're also the ones we never forget. And Ethan, finally at peace with himself and his choices, knew he'd learned the lesson he needed, that self-respect is never negotiable, and that some betrayals, no matter how subtle, deserve only one response: a dignified exit. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.